TLDL.
Welcome to the SQology Podcast. We're here with Benny Z and company, and also special guest Andy Wehmeyer, founder of Audio Frog Incorporated, and also lover of dim sum, and also owner of Dogs with an awesome Twitter account. I think I hit all the bits. Andy, do you have any more that you would like to be described as?
Old. I'm old.
Oh, okay.
I'm old, and I've been doing this, not podcasts, but I've been doing car audio for a really long time.
How did you get into car audio, first of all, and how did that ramp up to where you are today? I know it was a while back. At least 10 years, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, this was, I think, before automobiles. As a kid in high school, I was a pretty serious music lover. I was one of those nerds with a Walkman, between classes. And I shared a car with my father, which was, my dad always had weird cars. And he was kind of what I would call a low budget audio enthusiast. And when I was a little kid, I mean, he was always playing records and whatever. And my dad was a college theology professor at a little school in Missouri, and he didn't have a whole lot of cash, but he always had what I would consider to be sort of B-class audio stuff, and he was more of a music enthusiast than an audio gear enthusiast, but he recognized the need to have gear that was good enough for him to enjoy what he wanted to listen to. So I sort of grew up around that, and then when we moved to Texas, I got a driver's license. I shared a car with him, and for kids back then, the car was sort of your one opportunity to not be monitored by parents. And my dad was kind of a hands-off kind of a guy. Anyway, in one of the cars that he had, he did some DIY, which was at that time a 6x9 speaker installation where they weren't intended to go in a Plymouth Volare station wagon.
In the rear deck or partial?
Well, in a station wagon, there isn't really a rear deck. This was
okay.
This car was hot, but I crashed. But I crashed that thing, and that could be the subject for an entirely different podcast. And it was his favorite car ever in the whole wide world, and I crashed it, and I was banned from driving for a while, and then he got his second favorite car ever in the whole history of the universe, and that was a Plymouth Reliant K car.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, unbelievable. Great car. So as a way to get back in my dad's good graces, I installed a very basic system in that thing, and that was sort of how this started. And my grandfather was also kind of an audio enthusiast. He had years and years and years ago, you could buy home speaker kits. And he had a pair of home speakers that he built. I have these things somewhere upstairs in my garage. So I guess my dad and my grandfather were both sort of audio enthusiasts. And one day, somebody that they knew had one of those old console record players. This was like a giant piece of furniture, and the speakers in it were the speakers. I mean, what did I know? But the speakers in them still worked, and I didn't have a job, so these people gave me this thing, and I dragged it back to my grandfather's house where we were living, and he had a little wood shop. So I built some speakers and basically transferred the cheesy speakers from this big console thing into a pair of boxes that I built and finished and made grills for them and whatever else. My dad still has those somewhere. So that's sort of how it started. And then I was going to school. When I was in college, I started out as a physics major, but the guy that taught the first year physics class used to write on a whiteboard with yellow marker, and I was like, oh my God, I don't know that I can do 4 years of this. So I quit that and became an English lit major and a philosophy minor, and then I was a creative writing major. And during this time, I was delivering pizza, and a guy that I delivered pizza with had been in the Army. We were both sort of car audio enthusiasts at that point, and I had gone and gotten a Silo credit card. The Silo was a home and car, sort of a big box electronics store. I went and got a Silo credit card and loaded up an old Carmen Ghia that I had with Sony amps, and I think I bought some Concord speakers and whatever else. So I was delivering pizza in this thing, and this guy that was also delivering pizza was kind of a car audio enthusiast, but he'd been in the Army and knew how to solder. He went and talked himself into a job at a really good local car audio retailer in El Paso, and we were friends. And one guy from Tennessee, and one Saturday morning he called me. He says, "Hey," he says, "you awake?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah." I mean, I'd gotten home at like 3:30 in the morning after being out partying in Mexico. So I said, "Well, yeah, I'm awake." And he says, "Well, get your tools and get over here. They got a job for you." And I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." So my tools consisted of like a pair of needle nose vice grips, a couple of beat up old screwdrivers that I had forgotten to put back in my grandfather's shop, and all of this was in a nice little metal tackle box.
Nice.
So I show up at the car audio store with my tackle box and attempt to do a couple of basic, speaker installations. And the guy who owned the store recognized me as the worst customer he's ever had. So I think the day I walk in, I mean, it's like eyes rolling. It's like, oh my God, Jimbo, couldn't you find somebody? Yes, this guy. This is the guy who didn't have enough money for a $49 Jet Sound Under Dash EQ, but walked me around the store for 6 hours. So I was that guy, and I was a terrible installer, horrible. Jim, my friend from Tennessee, who later became my roommate, saved me 3 or 4 times, because Steve, the guy who owned the store, was like, he had it with me. He was ready to fire me. And, Jimbo kept telling him, no, give him a chance. Give him a chance. He learns fast. And I think I overheard that conversation one day. And Steve's response to he learns fast was, oh, yeah, I don't see it. Because this had been going on for 6 months, and I still couldn't figure anything out. So one day Steve comes back to me. We had a guy who used to build enclosures. And this was in the 80s. George was not all that reliable. Steve would call him and say, hey, we need you to come build a box because we've got a job here. And George might show up and he might not show up. And I think one day Steve got tired of waiting for George and comes back to me. I'm like struggling to install a pair of tweeters and something, and comes back and like taps me on the head with a stick and says, hey. And I'm like, yeah. He says, you think you can build a box out of wood? And I said, yeah, that I can do. I can do
this.
I can do
with
that.
My tackle box.
Yes, exactly. So by that time I had, I think, brought an old chest of drawers to the shop, and that's where I kept it.
That's awesome.
That is fun.
And this chest of drawers full of used cheap tools I bought at the flea market. So I became the box builder, and I was actually pretty good at that. And that sort of saved me from being fired and having to go back to delivering pizza. And then one day, after being the box builder, and we were doing a lot of boxes, every day I was back there building something, and I was pretty good at that. One day I came in. I got there early, and Steve says, hey, come over here. I got you something. And I'm like, you did? He says, yeah, because I had been, in order to build the right box, before this, I had to, I would call Serwin Vega, because those are the woofers that everybody used. I would call Serwin Vega. I would call ADS, or I would call whoever made the woofers and say, hey, I need to build a box. I'm sort of shocked that, 35 years later, that's still how people are, designing
right.
boxes. Nevertheless, I come in and Steve says, hey, I got you something. And I'm like, you did? And I'm thinking it's a pink slip, and then I've done, something else terrible. And I said, yeah, what is it? So he says, come over here. So I go around the counter, and he says, I got you a computer. I'm like, you what? So he bought me a computer, and this was the days of Commodore 64s right. And whatever. And so he bought a little IBM thing. I don't know how much it was at the time, but it was a desktop. And he had loaded into the computer some really basic enclosure design program, and another passive crossover program, because that's how we did, at the time, that's how we did crossover. So he taught me to use it, and I guess the fact that I could screw 6 pieces of wood together gave him something.
You can operate a computer.
Well, no, because it was basic. I think he saw me operating a calculator. At the time, that's kind of what a computer was a bigger calculator. Yeah, so he proceeded to teach me audio for the next 10 years that I worked for him. And I learned a lot from Steve. The store started out as a home audio store, a high-end home audio store. And in the 80s, car audio sort of became big, and it was more of a tinkerer's industry than home audio was. So I think that was why that was what attracted Steve to it, because he was a tinkerer and he was a tuba player in the symphony. So it was all about music for him, which was really helpful. So that's how I got started, and I worked for Steve for about 10 years. Became a manager of installers in 2 locations. I guess in one location we had 14 installers and 12 bays, and in the other location there were like 8 installers. And we had a bunch of guys out doing expediter work in the make-ready departments at many of the car dealerships in El Paso. So it was a huge store. We were Rockford dealer number 7 when Steve picked up MTX. I guess in the early 90s. Lloyd Ivy was the guy who came to training. This is how our amps work and all that kind of stuff. So I was fortunate to have started in a store like Steve's, where he was an audio guy. He was a tech. There wasn't a lot of mystery. If we couldn't figure out what was going on, then Steve broke out the test gear, which was good for me because I've always sort of been oriented in that direction. Which is get data to explain why this works, so that I can figure out whether it's going to work the next time I need to use it. And that was sort of Steve's perspective as well. So it was after he decided not to fire me 36 times, it was a comfortable way for me to get going. And then I left. I quit and I moved to Austin, Texas, because I had told my fiance at the time that if she found a job somewhere that I would move. And I was a good installer. I was by that time I was a Mira. This was before they were Mira. It was the magazine was called Installation News, but they did top 50 and top 12 even in the early 90s. And I was consistently one of the top installers, partly because of the store I worked in. But I moved. I went to Austin. I worked for a guy for 6 months, and that didn't really work out. Mike Giffen, who was had just taken over Infinity at Harman. They were looking for somebody sort of be a trainer and the face of a series of equipment called Beta. This was some full range Class D amps and a line of speakers that Rich Coe had developed. Rich left Infinity, and they were looking for somebody to replace Rich. And I think that Mike called and offered Steve, my old boss at the first shop, the job. And Steve's like, I have 40 employees. I'm not going to let everybody go so I can come be a project manager for you. But I think I know who could probably do it. So Steve referred Mike to me. To make a really long story, not quite as long as it could be, I took the job and was, for 20 years, I think probably the luckiest installer ever in the history of car audio, because I found myself with an office in the middle of the engineering department at Harman just after Dr. Harman decided that hiring the world's best engineers was the way to grow the audio business. But while I was at Harman, if I had questions about Teal and Small parameters, I could walk over to Richard Small's office and ask him. If I had questions about how to, about measuring equipment or, any of that kind of stuff. And one of the things that they handed me when I started the job was a lunchbox computer with a Melissa card in it. This is like, at the time, like $15,000 worth of test gear. I had no idea how to use it, and they sort of pointed me in the direction of engineering and said, those guys will help you. And they hired me like 2 weeks before CES, and my job at CES was to run an audio precision to show the difference in efficiency between our full-range Class D amps and a bunch of other non-Class D amps. We had an audio demo, which was a pair of Kappa 9s driven by a Krell 250 amplifier and one of our 100 watt per channel Class D amps. And so I was supposed to run an AB, an AB thing so that people could.
What year was this?
This was 1990, 86 to 95. This would have been CES 1996. Okay. So I didn't know how to run an AP, right? And we were at the Riviera Hotel, and they, put me in the suite where all this stuff was, and that was my job. I'm 2 weeks into a job at Harman, and this is what I'm supposed to do. So we get all this stuff set up, and Mike, the guy that I was working for, comes in and goes, there'll be some people to come over here and help show you how to work this stuff. So like half the engineering team comes over to show this new kid. I was 28 at the time, I think. Show this new kid how to work all this stuff because he used to be an installer and he could build boxes. Right? So I'm like descended upon by an entire engineering team to explain to me the AP and to get it all set up and whatever else. And coming from an installation shop where things are really competitive and where what is your power over everybody else in the shop and whatever else. This was a perspective that I had really never had any exposure to. The idea that people who were way smarter and knew way more than you were would like come and bail you out and introduce themselves to you at the same time. I was like, holy cow, this is great. And that's really cool. That's what Harman was like for the first 15 years that I worked there. And I think because I was sort of technical, what I recognized pretty early on was that my job as a product manager was to be in between sales and engineering. And what I discovered over the 15 or 18 years that I was a product manager there, that this is in fact what a project manager is supposed to do, because salespeople should never speak directly to engineers because they don't speak the same language, they don't have the same perspectives, and they don't even appreciate the same things. So I recognized early that my job was to make what the make what the engineers could do and what they could invent palatable for the sales guys, and to translate what sales guys say, which is basically, if I had this today, I could sell it, into, I can't give you what you need today, but I can give you what you will need 8 months from now. So I recognized that I needed to be able to speak to engineers on their terms and salespeople on their terms. And because I was technical and I had sort of been doing that as an installation manager at this big shop, it was easy for me. And the technical community at Harman sort of took me under their wing, because they were, I think, in a lot of cases, used to product managers who were more salespeople. They would come in and say, this doesn't work, or why can't you do this, or whatever. And I was there to learn just as much as I was to try to help make good products. So I mean, I could walk into Floyd Toole's office, knock on the door, and he'd be in the middle of something, and he'd say, "Oh, Andy, come on in," and he would tell somebody that he was talking to on the phone, "Just a minute, I'll call you back." Right. So I would sit down and say, "Man, this is going to be a really remedial question for you, but I need some help." And all of these guys would stop anything that they were doing to explain something to me. And I guess I was smart enough to recognize that this was something that was unique to where I worked, and that I ought to make the best of it. So I listened carefully. I took notes. I read a lot. I tried my best not to ask the same question twice. And I tried to make sure that, when I went in to ask these people to help me, that it was a good question, right? And it worked great. And that's how I learned most of what I know. There comes a point in that process where you know enough that it becomes really easy to assimilate new information. And I sort of discovered that after I left Harman, because it was really easy for me to go ask questions when I was there. But after I left, I didn't have access to those, to those same people in the same way. I mean, I'm still connected to a lot of them, and we're friends and whatever else, but I began to have to read more. And because I didn't have somebody, I didn't have the in-person YouTube video, where I could go in and, park myself in somebody's chair and have them put on a show for me. So I started reading, and I discovered how fortunate I was to have learned as much as I did, because now I can read stuff that's related to things that I know and understand it really quickly. And one of the reasons that they hired me was that I had, even when I left the retail shop, one of the things that I was really good at, and have sort of always been good at, is explaining things in a way that makes it possible for people who don't have a whole lot of technical background to at least understand the concept. Even as a kid, I was a good storyteller, and I always appreciated a good story. So when I gave up being a physics major in college because I couldn't deal with the yellow marker on the whiteboard, because I've worn glasses since I was like 5, I couldn't see anything, I shifted to an English degree and a creative writing degree, because I recognized that I was a storyteller. What I didn't recognize at the time is that I didn't really have any stories to tell. I wanted to be an author. So I didn't finish college, but I took a whole lot of writing classes and creative and critical writing classes. But I couldn't be an author because I wanted to write fiction, but I didn't have any stories to tell, right? Who at 28 has stories to tell besides like Mike Eggers or Dave Eggers? Sorry,
right,
Dave,
right.
Dave. Nobody, or maybe very few people. So I learned the skills of storytelling, both verbally and in writing, but I didn't have any stories to tell until I worked in a car audio store for 10 years, and then went to work for Harman for a few years. And then it was like all of a sudden I had some stories to tell, and I could, break out the tools that I had learned, which was, the ability to write and speak. So that's the story.
That's really cool. I don't know your background, and I had just kind of always assumed, I knew that you worked for Harman, but I always assumed that you had this massive amount of schools and education that they hired you for. I didn't know that you were an installer and you just networked your way into the position and then learned everything. That's really cool that A, that happened to you, and that B, they were, willing to take somebody in and share all that knowledge and train you up in the ways they needed to use you. That's pretty sweet.
Well, yeah, it is. And it's a good lesson in understanding the difference between what I think is the sort of business world where many of us live and the world of academics, because it's a very different perspective. I wasn't very successful in college because I was far too undisciplined, and I was working at the same time. I was delivering pizza, which is until 2 a.m, delivering pizza to soldiers on base and whatever. So very poorly disciplined. But what's great about finding yourself in a group of academics is the concept of peer review. And peer review is what academics do because they're unsure that what they've discovered or what they've written or what they've developed or whatever else is actually right. There comes a point in attending college and getting a degree, and then when you get higher level degrees, I mean, because a lot of the guys I was working with were PhDs. Here I am, I don't even have a degree, and I'm I have a bunch of PhDs that will stop everything they're doing to explain stuff to me and invent stuff for me and show me how to work stuff. And the idea that once you're finished with something that you should submit it without a bunch of ego to a bunch of people who know stuff that's different than what you know, and in some cases may have a much higher level of knowledge about a very specific part of what you've done, is not only is it expected, but these people are enthusiastic about submitting their work. Right?
Yeah.
Which is very different from what we're used to as business people, which is knowledge is power, and power is essentially leverage, and the idea that you get what you want, which is often money, by withholding what you know. In the interest of having a competitive advantage is a completely different. I mean, it's a completely different perspective. And as a product manager, my job was to be in between those two perspectives. So I had to learn them both, which was really cool. But yeah, sometimes those two different perspectives do not trust the other. They work very poorly together because the fundamental difference is trust and distrust, right? So often business folks, people who operate in what I think is sort of the world of leverage, simply do not understand that other, simply do not understand that perspective. And sometimes it creates an environment where experts are unable to provide the benefit of their expertise. I mean, I watched, while I was there, some of the most gifted inventors I've ever known just kept inventing stuff that never made it to market because the sales guys didn't understand it. But yeah, it was cool, and all of that is why I say that I'm like the luckiest car audio installer ever in the history of the world. So I kind of think that because I don't know anybody else who was lucky enough to have that info or to have access to the people that basically invented all of this stuff, I sort of feel like one of my jobs is to pass that around in the hopes that we can continue making cars sound great. While
you were at Harman, you weren't you instrumental in a large part for the development of the MS8? Was that it, or am I?
Well, yeah. So I was the project manager, I was the product manager for that product. And when I was in retail, we were a big store and one of the industry's favorite stores. So when companies like Eclipse and Sony and Pioneer all began to develop all of those bus systems, ODR and Alpine with AINet and F1 and all of those things, we often got a beta sample to install. So I had been installing DSPs since the beginning of Sony ES, which was 1992. And the guy I was working for basically gave me a Sony ES system and said, here, put it in your car. Because I think by that time he recognized that of all the people who worked for him, I was probably the one who was going to figure it out and help pass around to everybody else how cool it was and how to work it. So when I went to work for Harman, we were basically a speaker and amp company, with subs and whatever else. And I wanted to add DSP to the product line. And the guy I was working for, Mike, basically told me after I had begged and tried to explain why we needed a DSP. And he called me into his office one day and he said, I don't want to hear any more about this DSP. He says, because we're not going to hire 30 people to go out and train all these retailers. It's just impossible. He said, so you figure out how to make a DSP that tunes itself and I'll approve the project. He said, and I'm going to give you a hint. He says, you get yourself a plane ticket and go out to LA and find Dr. Ulrich Horbach. And he says he can probably help you. So I was like, cool. Can I go next week? He says, yeah, go next week. So I go out to LA and I sent Ulrich an email, never met the guy. So I go out to LA to talk to the R&D group, which was essentially Ulrich and another guy named Ashish, both mathematicians and acousticians. And I guess Mike had given them a primer. So I go into their little lab and they had already done this for receivers. They'd already done this for receivers, and they were eager to do the project. And so we made arrangements for them to come to New York and make hundreds of measurements of the car that I had built as an R&D thing, because I kept building my own car to demonstrate to the people who had the cash in the company that there was a good reason for us to make this product. So that's how it started. And then I shepherded that thing through a whole bunch of different senior level managers and even company CEOs who wanted to kill the project. It took like 7 years. But yeah, that was my
Gotcha.
thing. And I got hooked up with a really great project manager, Mark Trainer, who one of the smartest guys I've ever known. This guy, I mean, he just figures out everything. He's super smart. And, I'll call him on the phone, even now. And I'm like, hey, man, what are you doing? He's like, I'm learning to make bacon. I'm like, what do you mean you're learning to make bacon? He says, yeah, I don't know how to make bacon. So I'm curing pork in the garage. I'm like, okay. So 2 weeks later, I get this big slab of bacon. It's like the best bacon I've ever eaten. And then nice. I call him up to say thanks for the bacon. I'm like, what are you doing now? He goes, I don't know how to make soap. So I'm making soap. He says, I'm waiting for a bunch of lye to show up. I just ordered it. So 2 weeks later, I get a big batch of soap. and this is his hobby. His hobby is figuring out how the world works. So I learned a ton from him on that project, including the importance of a very detailed product specification and an unbelievable amount of engineering. Stuff that I know is directly because I worked with Mark. So Harman was just basically a parade of people who changed my life for the better for 15 years.
So 2 things. Going back to you saying how you're really good at explaining things in a way that can be associated. I remember, I think it was several years ago now, on one of the Facebook groups, and somebody was arguing about, I believe, file compression. And your analogy was something like, think of compression as there's a gigantic, lightning storm happening outside your house, and cat jumps off your bed and lands, and the difference is that the compression doesn't worry about the cat's noise during this entire big lightning crash. It was something like that. I'm not trying to steal your analogy, but it's those kinds of things that have clicked in my head over the years of when you've explained things that have definitely stuck, and we're grateful for that.
I've heard a story about a duck walking around and back and forth, and
well, except for that analogy, I'm not sure about that one.
Some of them are too weird to make any sense. But the one with the cat, I mean, it's basically the way that perceptual coding works is that they throw away sounds that you're unlikely to hear. And so my example is you're sitting on the couch watching TV with your cat, and at the same time that your cat meows, your neighbor's house explodes. MP3 throws away the cat.
Gotcha.
Right.
And depending on, so all of those kinds of things, nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect. Everything is as close to perfect as people can get it under some condition. Right. And what we often forget about in audio is the condition, right? What's the intended use case versus what are edge cases? And for people who are really high-end audiophiles, often that perspective is an edge case, right? So can you hear the difference between an MP3 and a WAV file? Under some conditions, yeah, right? The question is not always can you hear a difference, is my experience diminished by the difference?
Correct.
And for a lot of us, and for me included, my experience in listening to music is not diminished by an MP3 at 320K. And because it isn't diminished, and because it not being diminished by that algorithm that makes it possible for me to have a whole bunch of stuff on an iPod, my perspective was, okay, so if it isn't diminished and these people are telling me that it should be diminished, I want to know why. So the range of answers to that question are my ears suck and I can't tell the difference because my ears suck. The music that I listen to is music that isn't degraded by that algorithm, or it could be that the idea that the experience is diminished is more religion than science. So when I discovered that, my inclination was to see if I could figure it out. So I put some files as WAV files and also as MP3s in my computer and used Adobe Audition. And what I discovered is that at 320, the difference between those two is not big enough to even appear in a measurement that makes the difference obvious. And I used to do this. I used to do a training when I was at Harman, when I was out trying to pitch the benefits of an MS8. And that was that at the time, the entire audio industry was like, iPods suck. If you bring your iPod into my high-end store, you ought to just leave because I can't even talk to you. That was the whole industry perspective, which was not a good one. And my pitch was, look, man, worry about stuff that matters, because bad EQ or no EQ is much more seriously degrading to your experience in listening than the fact that a CD has been turned into virtually the same information in another format. And sometimes my desire to figure out or to get to the bottom of what those differences actually are rubs audiophiles the wrong way. Right. And I have plenty of unintended arguments with people who don't share necessarily that same perspective, which is get to the bottom of it. I want to know what stuff is, right? Once I can figure out what stuff is, or figure out to the best of my ability what it is, then I can do a better job of explaining it to people. And sometimes we have our personas and our egos wrapped up in a belief about what things should be rather than what they are. And I think that sometimes that creates that kind of friction. Right. And mostly when I write on Facebook or on the Audio Frog website or whatever, tech tips that I write are primarily intended for industry professionals, right? It's processes that I suggest, and like vehicle tuning and all that kind of stuff. Those are really directed at guys in the installation bays who are trying to do a job for a customer. That's a very different perspective than a process that might be designed for an enthusiast, right? Because a DIY guy, his objective is the process of installing and tuning and then getting rid of that gear and installing something else and tuning it and whatever else. Where the installation and the tuning is the end, right? That's what that guy wants to do. He wants to put a system in his car so that every weekend he can spend 30 hours in the garage tuning and tuning and tuning and tuning and tuning. That's not the same as working on a car for a customer who's going to pick his car up on, Friday night and needs a process that, that guy needs a process that he can deploy that's predictable and based on, I'm going to use the word, a compromise between speed, efficiency, and overall performance. Right. Sure. So sometimes the enthusiast, anytime you use the word compromise, thinks that they're missing out on something and that there can be no compromises. And that's not how audio works. Audio is a matter of managing compromises from the very beginning in order to get to the best possible result. So sometimes when I write stuff, the enthusiast crowd sees it from a different perspective, and that can occasionally create problems. I've been accused of taking sound quality back 20 years when I suggest that measuring the distance between the listening position and the speakers with a tape measure is accurate enough for anything. And I have the data to back it up. And that's not a suggestion that renders the system poorer because the process is simpler. Sometimes the things that I write are controversial in the enthusiast crowd or, among competitors and whatever else. But my objective is in all of those tuning tips, simplicity and a process that can be understood, which is useful for professionals.
No, understood completely. And I'm going to back up a little bit because I know Ben is chomping at the bit to ask this.
Oh.
You gave us the MP3 versus CD. Given the same mastering, what's your opinion on CD versus high res?
All right.
I was done asking that question, just so you know.
Oh, you were so waiting to ask that question.
So I've written a little bit about this, and there's a bunch of graphics and what I can sort of consider to be marketing graphics that are designed to sell new audio processes to the enthusiast crowd. So on the Audio Frog website, if you go to forums and then into tech tips, there's one called Digital Audio Basics. The way digital audio works, in a nutshell, if you look at the specs for D-to-A converters or file types or whatever, what you'll see is a sample rate and a bit depth, right? This is 44.1, 16-bit, that's CD. So sample rate determines the highest frequency that can be accurately reproduced by that sample rate. That doesn't mean what that means, and it's based on the Nyquist theorem, which says that for any periodic signal, which is a sine wave, or a combination of sine waves, that 2 points on that sine wave are sufficient to accurately define the sine wave, right? 3 points, and it's kind of like a line. And I mean, if you took geometry class in high school, then you know that a line in space can be defined by 2 points. 2 points in space is a line. And a line is a line is a line is a line is a line. And
right.
if you had 30,000 points that were all on that same line, guess what it would still be?
A line.
It would be the same line, right? So so for a CD, CDs can reproduce accurately up to 22K. We hear, before we destroy our hearing with 2 fittings and 10,000 watts, we can hear up to 20K. Right. As a 50-year-old guy who has had plenty of systems with 2 fittings, I only hear up to about 16K. And that's pretty common. In fact, that may be a little better than most guys my age. But a CD is accurate up to 20K. That extra 2K in there is designed to allow for a low pass filter, which is required to remove some noise in the digital process. So when you go from 44K up to 48K or to 192K, that defines the highest frequency that can be accurately reproduced by that sample rate. Right. So at 192K, what is that? 88. Now we can reproduce up to 80K.
Right.
I don't hear over 16. Right.
So I have a question related to that.
Yeah.
So all those frequencies above 20K exist in the world around us. We don't hear them, but they're there, and they affect. I guess that's part of my question. Do they affect the way that we perceive the sound that we do hear, in a way that we don't hear them? If that makes sense. Well, so let's say,
I don't know.
Assuming you have a capable driver of playing up to 40K, if there's information between 20K and 40K that's there, but we don't hear it, does that still affect the way that we perceive the sound that we do hear?
I don't know the answer to that. Uh-huh. What I do know is that culturally there are different perspectives. I am inclined to say no, because I have never experienced that, right? Determining the answer to that question is the purview of the scientific community, right? So currently among audio engineering, the answer to that question is I doubt it. There are people working on tests and whatever, and if you Google this, or if you Google patents, or if you join the Audio Engineering Society, you can find some papers and some experimentation that has been done here and there that suggests, although hasn't proven otherwise. But since the beginning of my time at Harman, I've traveled to Japan many times. And Japanese audiophiles believe that, yes, it does affect your perception of the event. I've sat through demos when I've been in Japan, and I have never experienced it. I've never seen a ghost either. Right?
What about?
I've never seen a ghost.
Well, what about frequencies below 20 hertz that we don't hear, but they're there, and they definitely affect the way that we enjoy the experience? Is it similar to that, or no?
I don't know. I mean, so below 20 hertz, yeah. I mean, I think that we have below 20 hertz, provided that the sound is loud enough, we may hear harmonics above that 20 hertz or above that 10 hertz or whatever else, depending on what the sound is. But really high level sounds at really low frequencies those are violent events, right? We feel air moving, and we earthquake happens happens at frequencies that are below our ability to hear, and certainly, I mean, I live in LA. There are occasions when it's like, hey, holy shit, what's that? Oh, it's an earthquake. Cool. And stuff starts rattling and whatever else. And when the book falls off the shelf, that is a high frequency component of the earthquake, right? So yeah, I mean, and I can't say whether we don't perceive.
I can't either.
What happened?
I have this
at frequencies above 20K. But what I can say definitely is that if we have a speaker system that has response out to 20K, and we play a high-res file through a speaker that basically doesn't respond at 40K, then guess what? We don't hear or feel or experience or whatever else.
The entire system from start to finish has to be capable of reproducing those frequencies.
Yeah, right. Yes, of course. I'm not at this point ready to concede that as an industry. Remember, my perspective is primarily about helping an industry do a better job of meeting customer expectations and providing great experiences for people who love music. I'm not ready to concede that we are at the point at which we need to be focused on what we might not or might be able to perceive outside of what we can actually hear. Because in my travelings around the world for 30 years, I've heard some really great audio systems, and I've heard a lot of them that sucked. And that sucked because the fundamentals haven't been addressed. Fundamentals being lack of distortion in the speaker system, fundamentals being the ability to play at least the whole audio band that we can hear, and poor frequency response. So, and this gets back to that PowerPoint that I was doing when we were trying to get MS8 launched. It's like let's focus on getting to the point where we can reliably deliver on the fundamentals before we go ape shit over the fringe stuff. Because a high-res file played back over a Bluetooth speaker that's the size of a beer can doesn't matter.
Right.
So that doesn't mean that high-res doesn't matter. The beauty of high-res, and I own lots of high-res recordings, the beauty of high-res is that it gives, from my perspective, it gives the guy who's recording and mastering the music an obvious reason to do a better job. Right?
Absolutely.
The upholstery stitching in a Ferrari is not the same thing as the upholstery stitching in my car or like a Kia Optima, right? And the reason that the upholstery stitching is better in a Ferrari is because the guy who's buying a Ferrari is probably inclined to appreciate the additional attention to detail and the craftsmanship that goes into a car that costs $100,000 compared to a Kia, where there's nothing wrong with it and where the upholstery stitching is not a huge part of somebody's purchase decision because the customer is different. There's an easy way for the person who's doing the work to understand that the high-res file may be intended for a different audience and one that would appreciate a recording that isn't smashed with only 3 dB of dynamic range and whatever else. So in the event that the high-res is a different piece of music, which is what a different master is, then there's a good reason to buy it. And I own lots of those, and I turn them into MP3s at 320, and I put them on my so that I can listen to them in the car because I can't hear the difference between even a CD
That's awesome.
and MP3 at 320, right? So for me, the benefit of high res is access to much better pieces of music.
A while back, a bunch of studio guys and recording artists and stuff that got together to make this beautiful video about compression, and it seemed like they were completely
conflating the two.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Between, compression for, during mastering versus compression for an MP3, for example.
Yes. Dynamic range compression and data compression are not the same. And there is no dynamic range compression included in turning something that's a WAV file into an MP3.
Right.
The crest factor does not change. It does not make the music sound mushy. It's a confusion because it's the same word that means two completely different things in those two completely different circumstances. So when you're trying to decide whether to get the high-res track or to not get the high-res track, I think it's useful to know whether you're getting the original CD track simply changed into a high-res format, which means that all those additional bits are set to 1, right? Mm-hmm. Or 0.
Right.
Or whether you're getting a different and better piece of music. I'm all for any improvement that helps us as an industry do a better job of providing great experiences for customers, and I'm also totally ready to support any additional or new technology that increases consumers' desire for us to do a better job. But I'm only interested in understanding what it is and explaining what it is. I'm not interested in what it should be or what it could be or all of the other completely unsubstantiated things. But like I said, I've never seen a ghost. But I'm not ready to say that there are no ghosts because I know people who absolutely say that they've seen a ghost, right? I haven't. So I'm not going to talk about whether ghosts exist or don't exist. What I can say is that I have not experienced a ghost. And for things audio, if I have data that suggests that something is or is not what people say it is, then I'm willing to provide that data. But I'm also eager to learn, and I've spent a long time learning from people who know more than I do. So the fact that I say I haven't experienced it and I have this data that suggests that there may not be much to experience doesn't mean that if somebody has other data that I wouldn't consider it. Of course I would. Right? I mean, my whole perspective is to try to figure out what things are so that I can explain those things in ways that people who attempt to make a living making customers really happy can implement them in what they do in a predictable way that helps everybody put their kids through college and make customers happy. But a completely subjective analysis under some undocumented conditions where somebody says, I listened to this and I liked it better, therefore all of the things that I've ever been told about it must be true, is not data.
I agree with that.
Right? That's an experience. And so when we have those kinds of experiences, so the world is not defined by what we can measure, right? We devise ways to measure experiences for which we don't currently have something that we can use to measure them. Right? So to say that somebody who does a completely subjective analysis and discovers that they can hear something that they cannot measure may mean that they didn't really hear it, or it may mean that we simply don't have a way to measure it, right? But the person who is qualified to say, do we have a way to measure it or do we not have a way to measure it, is not a beginner who has only one way to measure things, right? The person who's best qualified to say, you know what, I agree with you, there's an experience that we don't have a way to measure, is somebody who understands well all of the measuring tools that we have. Right? Let's say this was a thing that was on DIY-MA just the other day, somebody ranting about people placing too much stock in their microphone, right? The fact that the microphone doesn't tell me everything I need to know about the way my system sounds means that the microphone is crap. And it's like, well, no, that's not what it means at all. It means that you don't understand what an RTA or what your piece of analysis gear is telling you, right? Because it's not telling you everything. So an analogy would be, let's say you had a shoebox and you wanted to know how much Jell-O you needed to make to put in the shoebox. So you got out your tape measure and you measured the length of the shoebox. And now you still don't know how much Jell-O to put in there. That doesn't mean that the tape measure is a piece of shit. Right? Right? So then you say, well, maybe if I knew how much Jell-O weighed, I could figure out how much Jell-O to make, right? So you get out your tape measure again and you measure the width of the box. And now you still don't know how much Jell-O goes in there. So you say, this tape measure is worthless, right? Well, clearly the tape measure isn't worthless. The problem is that somebody didn't know how to use the tape measure, or to understand that measuring the length of the box is not sufficient for us to determine the volume of something that could be put in the box.
Right.
And those kinds of rants and those kinds of explanations often devolve into, well, since I can't know because the tool doesn't tell me, then I should rely on my ears. And ears can also be an objective tool for understanding what something sounds like, but only if you're trained to understand what your ears are telling you, right? I like it and it is good are two completely different statements. And too often as enthusiasts, we say something pleases me, therefore it is scientifically better. And that may not be the case, right?
I think we see that in competition all the time, because there might be something that everybody says, man, that's great sounding car. And then it does terribly. A lot of the difference is when even you yourself, as trained judges who also listen to things, what you think a car sounds like and what you end up putting down as data on a score sheet is going to be different.
Well, so the score sheet is an attempt to turn subjective analysis into something objective, right? When you're called on as a judge to determine where left and left of center and right of center and right are, that is using a subjective tool, which is your ears, and a track that's designed to allow you to use your ears to objectively determine the placement of a sound, right?
Correct. Yes.
So that the whole competition format is about using a subjective tool to make some objective determinations about the performance of a system. So I think that's a totally worthy, thing to do.
But does that translate into how enjoyable the system is overall? And I think that's where Cliff was.
Well, right. So this is the difference between meets spec and meets customer expectation.
Right.
And this is another thing that, so if you're a product manager, or if you have a job or even a hobby in developing things that are intended to meet an objective, there are two distinctly different parts of that. And spec writing is an exercise in constraining what is going to be developed into a thing, right? A spec is designed to say, if you make this thing, then I can sell a bunch of them. Or if you make this thing, it will meet this objective, which is to please a customer, right? So the person writing the spec has to understand what the customer's expectations are, right? And we sometimes forget about the spec, right? Products are designed to do what they do. And whether what they do meets our expectation, which is in many cases a matter of preference, that may or may not be part of the spec, right? So what you get when you follow the rules, whether it's Mecca or IASCA or EMMA or whatever else, if you do everything right and you score, and if two cars scored a perfect score, then we would expect that they sound the same. If the scoring was objective, not a matter of preference or using a subjective tool in the interest of performing an objective analysis, then we would expect that two things that were completely characterized by measurements would sound the same, right?
But they don't.
Well, exactly. And that's where the breakdown happens, right? And that gets us back in a sort of a roundabout way to the box, the shoebox, the Jell-O, and the tape measure, right? The fact that they don't sound the same doesn't mean necessarily that those objective measurements are wrong. It may mean, A, that we didn't make a complete set of measurements, that our measurements don't expose a particular part of the performance that we hear, right? That doesn't mean the measurements are bad. That means that the measurements are incomplete. It could also mean that they don't sound the same because our process of turning a subjective analysis into an objective evaluation is flawed, right? And I think that that's sometimes the difference between two cars that score the same. If the scores were all exactly the same, and it was completely objective, then they would in fact be the same, but they're not. That doesn't impugn the measurements, or it doesn't impugn measurements or objective analysis in general, but it may suggest that we don't have a complete characterization of the audio system. But I think that it's wrong to say that, okay, so I scored a 100 and you scored a 100, the cars don't sound the same. What we often do, instead of figuring out what additional measurements need to be made so that we can better understand from an objective standpoint the differences, we make stuff up. Right? We say, oh, because I used a particular kind of wood, or because the speakers are mounted this way or that way or whatever else, that is in fact the difference. That's conjecture. And too often that conjecture becomes part of the lexicon of talking about audio, right? At the point where the two cars that don't sound the same score exactly the same, instead of making stuff up and saying, basically, because I like it, here's why it works, we should do the rest of the work in figuring out what in fact are the differences so that we can deploy whatever it is that makes the one better than the other reliably in other situations.
Right.
That's how we know when something works, right? When something works, that means, and we understand why it works, that means we can do it again.
Yeah. And
it also means that if we understand why it works, we can do it again in a situation that it is not exactly the same. The door panels are a different shape. The windshield is a different shape. At the point where we understand it, then we can say, well, because the door panel is a different shape, we're likely to experience something different. And because we understand it, we can take some preventative measures to make it work as well as it should work, even though the environment is different, right? But so often what happens in the difference between the academic perspective, which is let's figure out why that is and what makes it different, and the enthusiast perspective, which is, oh my God, it's different. That means it's different and I like it better. That means that whatever I make up to explain those differences is in fact scientific. And that's not the case.
I think a lot of people get frustrated with competition because some of us just do it just in our blood, and that's what we do. And flaws and all, we kind of overlook, what might be there. But there are other people that come in for a year or two and they get all in and they see objectively, this is the things I need to reach to obtain Mecca with 2 C's. And then they get disillusioned over time because there's no real formula. It just kind of happens. And I guess skipping a little bit back on what you were talking about between engineering and the academics versus sales and the business people in giving information or retaining it. Now that you're kind of at both ends of that, what's your perspective on that? We all see you giving a lot of information into the field and everything else, but how do you think that translates for you overall from a business perspective and for Andy in the industry?
So is the question, dude, how do you make any money if you give all this stuff away? Is that what you're asking me?
Kind of, yeah.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I guess my perspective is, after spending so much time where I spent time, any kind of scientific process, and that's what I see the development of speakers as being, if you follow the rules, then you can predict what something is going to do based on your following the rules, right? So there's no perfect speaker, and what happens in a lot of cases is that as enthusiasts or as users of products, we sort of gravitate towards to a particular. So developing everything, speakers in particular, is a matter of, I'll use the word again, managing a bunch of compromises, right? So as enthusiasts, and the higher end enthusiasts we are, the less we are willing to accept that what we're paying for is a compromise, right?
Right.
Ideally, if money was no object, I should be able to buy the perfect thing, right? Well, in some cases that is possible, but with speakers especially, because they're electromagnetic devices, changing one thing changes a million other things, right?
Yep.
So developing a speaker is a matter of knowing what you want it to do under a particular set of conditions and optimizing the speaker for that particular use case, right? So there's the lead up to my perspective about giving away information. The information that I give away are the rules, right? That's what I talk about. These are the rules. These are things we know about making cars sound great. These are the things we know about making speakers that make it possible to make cars sound great using this process, right? There are other processes. So I give away information because the information that I give away, I have used and found it to be reliable, which is useful for people who are trying to make a living making customers happy because it's predictable, and also because those are the rules under or for which I've developed these speakers, right? So it's a matter of saying, look, if you understand this and you do it this way, what you will discover is that these things work in the way that you'll expect. Right? So in order for somebody to appreciate what is great about an AudioFrog speaker, they either need to already use a process that's similar to the one that I suggest, or they need to adopt a process based on the rules that I understand in order to get the most out of their speakers. My perspective in giving away the information, there are two, right? One of them is that if you have the information, or if you assimilate the information that I give, you'll have a much better experience using my speakers. In some cases, you'll have a much better experience in using other speakers that are designed by following the same set of rules that I use. But you may have a worse time with other speakers that are designed by managing compromise in a different way, right? There is no perfect speaker. The speakers that I make are designed to do this in this way. The speakers that somebody else makes may be designed to do something similar in a different way. Right. So in order for people to appreciate and to be successful with the stuff that I make, then I need to tell them how they can be successful. The other reason that I give away the information that I give away is because I have it and not everybody else has it. Right. And this is an industry that I love, and I've worked in the industry for 30 years. When I started, I was a complete neophyte. I had no idea what I was doing. And now that's not the case. So I'd like for an industry that exists to make people really happy listening to music in their cars because that's what they like to do. I'd like to see that industry continue because I think that in the aftermarket, we serve a level of enthusiast that is poorly served by the OEM, by many OEM systems. But OEM systems are designed by PhDs who get to design a system for 3 years, right? Mm-hmm. And aftermarket systems are rarely designed by PhDs who rarely have more than a couple of weeks to implement it, right? So, and increasingly what we do in the aftermarket depends, our success in the aftermarket depends on our ability to figure out what is currently in the OEM system and to improve the things that it doesn't do well according to what our customer expects, right?
Absolutely.
So that's one of the reasons that I give some of this away, is because in order for the industry to be able to continue doing what we've done for 30 years, we have to get better. And this perspective, this idea that all we have to do in order to be successful in implementing an upgrade in a car is to get back to what we had, in the 80s, which is a left and right RCA output, so that we can build a basic simple stereo system, which is what we've been doing in car audio for 35 years, I think is insufficient. Because factory systems, while they don't often play loudly enough for an enthusiast, they don't often have enough bass for an enthusiast. And frankly, sometimes the frequency response is terrible. And sometimes what we expect in the aftermarket in terms of imaging, which is a center image in the center of the dash, is not the spec. A lot of the OEM, a lot of the car factories, car companies in their audio departments believe that the driver should have a center image directly in front of him and the passenger should have a center image directly in front of him. In the aftermarket, we say that's wrong, right? And sometimes, too often, when we get in a car with a factory system and we hear that, that's sort of the entry point at which we can say this system is good or this system is bad, right? What we don't realize is that was the spec. We say this sucks because it doesn't do what we expect it to do. And then we go about trying to figure out how to completely rip out everything that was done and go back to a basic stereo system that we've been installing for 30 years. And when we do that without understanding what our customer appreciates about his factory system, sometimes we eliminate features that they like. What if our customer comes in and says, man, this thing doesn't sound good, we need to fix it, blah, blah, blah. And his wife happens to be a blind concert pianist who is also an audiophile. And she's blind, so she can't drive. Right? So one of the things that she's appreciated about the factory system, although the frequency response isn't right and there isn't enough bass, is that when she sits in the passenger seat, she has a decent experience, right? If we don't know that, and we don't know that having a decent experience in the passenger seat is one of the things that our customer appreciates, and we say, oh, we know exactly what to do, and we rip out the up mixer and we rip out the center channel and we put in a pair of speakers in the front and we delay it so it sounds great in the driver's seat, and we think that he's going to be happy, and he comes to pick up the car and he sits in the driver's seat and he says, man, this sounds much better. But guess what? My wife is a blind concert pianist and I drive her around all day and she sits in the passenger seat and she's going to hate this. Right? We've done a really poor job in that case of understanding what our customers' expectations are, and we've assumed that a 30-year-old spec is going to make them happy, right? So that's a sales issue and that's a customer qualification issue, but it's also an issue of our inability or our overlooking our duty, I think, as somebody who's going to install an upgrade in this car to determine, in fact, what the system in the car is, right? And if we had thought for 15 minutes, or if we knew that they might appreciate better performance in the passenger seat, then we might have done a more thorough evaluation of the factory system than sitting in the driver's seat for 30 seconds and saying there's no image. The image is not where I expect it to be, therefore this thing sucks. Because further exploration would have elucidated the fact that there's a similar image in the passenger seat, and we can't even do that in the aftermarket. Right? We don't have the gear in the aftermarket to do that, right? Which is one of the reasons why we're not sensitive to it, why we wouldn't explore, right? So the fact is that because there's a similar experience in the passenger seat and in the driver's seat, and we can't do that in the aftermarket, means that somebody has done something to make that possible. And our job might be to figure out how we can improve on that performance in both seats. It turns out that it's really easy. We keep the up mixer, we keep the factory system because it does something that we can't do, which is to provide a symmetrical experience in the passenger seat and the driver's seat. All we have to do to turn that into an appropriate aftermarket system is to turn the level of the center channel up.
Right.
Right? Pretty simple.
The term gets thrown around a lot, but is it possible to define and explain an up mixer and what it does?